Hello everyone, welcome to the second lecture video of the second week of February and covering the chapter 3 themes of art. So in this chapter we will discuss the themes of art and we will learn how to describe how artists represent everyday life, discuss how art is used to reflect on the human experience, recognize invention and fantasy in art, and characterize the representation and these of the natural world in art, and restate how artists respond to art and its institutions. So these are the topics that we did not get to look from the last chapter. So yeah, let's dive in. So the themes that we looked at from the last chapter, the social order, the world of the sacred, history and the great stories of the past, these are all the themes that we looked before. And all of these are very important and themes, grand and important themes. But art does not always have to be this, grandeur. It does not have to reach so high. Sometimes it is enough just to look around ourselves and notice what our life is like here, in this place, at this time, the everyday life that we go through. So the example we are looking at here is called Gas by Edward Hopper, painted in 1940. So he used to be my favorite painter when I was in high school, by the way. So in this painting, excuse me, Hopper depicted the everyday world of mid-20th century America, actually North America, United States. And we are looking at a solitary man tending to the gasoline pumps at his small roadside service stations. Excuse me. So he is not like a hero or like a sacred saint or anything like that. He's just a regular, ordinary citizen running a small business, just like, ourselves. So Hopper's scene often depicts an isolated human subject within an empty space. Here he conjures that magical hour when artificial light mingles with the light of the dying day. So the human subject matter of his painting it has nothing to do with any kind of a grandeur or importance. He captures the everyday moment that we go through, and he does it in such a beautiful way. The way he uses the light I think is just so beautiful. So this is this is probably the most famous painting of him, called Nighthawks, painted in 1942. Now resides in the Art Institute of Chicago. So actually I got to see this painting in real life when I lived in Chicago when I was in middle school. And when I first saw it, he instantly became my favorite artist. So notice his close attention to light and how he depicts such a solitary scene with a little to none subject matter to convey the feeling of loneliness. At the same time, there's really strong intimacy. I think it's just beautiful work of art, and he's such a talented artist. So let's take a look at a little bit deeper into this painting, Nighthawks.
Looking into the space of this diner through these glass windows makes me feel really aware of the sound of my own footsteps on the sidewalk.
We're in the Art Institute of Chicago and we're looking at Edward Hopper's Nighthawks from 1942, this classic American painting that's usually seen as an expression of wartime alienation, of the notion of separation, and it really is about separation. Look at the warm light in that diner and compare it to the exterior. You get a sense of the quiet conversation that might be taking place inside, but we have no access to that. In fact, there's not even a doorway to let us into this restaurant.
There's an immediate implication that we are alone. It almost starts to feel frightening.
There's a way that the painting functions as a kind of prism that amplifies or intensifies not only the sense of silence, but also the way in which light fills this space. Look at the way in which the warm light of that interior filters out onto the sidewalk, creating a series of shadows and areas of light that seem to lay over each other and create this complex set of rays on the sidewalk. And the way in which the light hits the glass as it turns around the corner of this building, leading us to that sharp diagonal across the street where that lonely cash register stands as the only recognizable object.
But you can imagine life around it at another time of the day. But now it's all eerily silent, and it makes us look up at those windows for some sign of life, but we don't see anything.
We can see blinds that have been pulled down by somebody at some point but seem now completely abandoned. We can imagine perhaps the inhabitants asleep, but but there's no presence, no human life.
And then we just want to know, what are these figures doing together? Did that couple come in together? Did they meet here? Why is the male figure sitting alone? Why has he wandered into this diner so late at night? What are they talking about? It's all very open. There's not a clear narrative here at all.
The only clarity is the sense of isolation, the sense of alienation. And I find this especially interesting if you think about the year in which this was painted, 1942, the height of the Second World War. In some ways, the cities were emptied out. There were a lot of people that had gone overseas.
It was a time of great fear and anxiety in America.
That's right. This was really the height of the violence of the war, and nobody knew which way the war was going to turn at this point.
And these are subjects that preoccupied Hopper for his entire career, images of loneliness and isolation in the new urban spaces.
But this is also a rendering that is particularly American. It's generalized. We don't know precisely where we are. Hopper lived in Greenwich Village, and certainly the brick buildings behind us are reminiscent of the architecture that we might find in the village. But this is not a specific street corner. This is not a specific cafe. It is a kind of stripping away of everything that's non-essential, so that we're left with a kind of idealized rendering of these forms of this American experience.
And there's a sense of that in the geometry of the composition, the horizontal line.
One of America's foremost painters, Winslow Homer, and his painting Croquet Scene. Another example located in Art Institute of Chicago. So Homer served during the war as a battlefront correspondent and illustrator for Harper's Weekly. Afterward, he dedicated much of the rest of his career to creating affecting images of everyday American life that reflect nostalgia for simpler times. The Croquet Scene depicts a cheerful scene set in the countryside, and Croquet Players is emblematic of post-Civil War American genre painting. Another example we looked at by George Seurat. So the next topic is about the human experience, looking inward, our desire and emotions. One of the most common of human wishes is to talk with those who is no longer here, someone who passed away. So the many religions embrace the idea that the dead from a vast spirit community capable of helping us, and many rituals have been devised to honor ancestors and their spirits. But all the rituals in the world do not compensate for the ache we sometimes feel when we wish we could speak to those who came before, to tell them what we have become, to ask for guidance, or to compare experiences, or to explain, or even just to listen. Metalwork Fuller's sculpture, Talking Skull, depicts that wish being granted. Here, a figure kneeling before the skull, naked and vulnerable, the figure seems to hear an answer to his pleading. So on one level, this work of art embodies the common desire for communion beyond the boundaries of our brief lifetime. But it is also a specifically African American work that addresses the traumatic rupture with ancestral culture that slavery had produced. Woman Testing a Balance is an oil painting by Dutch Golden Age painter Jons Vermeer, now in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. So if you're in DC next time, check out the National Gallery of Art. It's a great museum, and after all, it is free to enter. They have a beautiful collection, by the way. At one time, the painting, completed around 1662 or 1663, was known as Woman Weighing Gold, but closer evaluation has determined that the balance in her hand is empty. So opinions on the theme and the symbolism of this painting changed, with the woman alternatively viewed as a symbol of holiness and earthliness. So in this painting, stillness pervades the picture. A gentle half-light filtered through the curtain window reveals a woman contemplating an empty jeweler's balance. So the painting is a depiction of the Last Judgment from the Christian faith, and the jewels and jewelry often serve as symbols of vanity and the temptation of earthly treasure. So scholars have debated whether the woman is pregnant or whether the fashion of the day simply makes her appear so. Either way, we can say that she looks pregnant, and the miracle of birth and the renewal of life. So you can see how the subject of the Last Judgment is depicted in this way, which evokes a much stronger feeling of familiarity and intimacy compared to Michelangelo's Last Judgment, where the image depicts a very crowded scene with otherworldly images we do not feel the strongest connection to. So it is amazing how the same subject can be expressed so differently, evoking different sense of emotions. So speaking of Michelangelo, let's talk about him a little bit more. This sculpture is called Pieta by Michelangelo, completed in 1489. So this famous work of art depicts the body of Jesus on the laps of his mother Mary after the crucifixion. In here, Michelangelo commemorates the sacrifice of Christ while depicting a very strong human emotion and experience, which is death, especially in this case, death of a child, losing a child. However, Mary's facial expression is very minimal, not indicating too much about any kind of emotion. So later iteration of this same subjects, Pieta, evokes different level of emotions. So if you look at the painting by El Greco, an artist we looked before, packs much more stronger human emotion to the depicted characters, creating a stronger connection to his viewers, I think. Let's take a look at the Michelangelo's Pieta.
We're in St. Peter's Basilica, standing in front of Michelangelo's Pieta.
I feel very lucky because on this rainy Monday morning, we're the only ones.
And it actually looks quite small.
It does.
In relationship to the chapel that holds it, but also especially in relationship to St. Peter's, which is so vast.
Of course, this sculpture was made for Cardinal, but then it was placed in the old St. Peter's, which was significantly smaller than this one. And so it would have had a different relationship to the architecture.
But what I'm finding interesting is, despite the fact that it's relatively small and probably about 20 feet away from us, it's still a really intimate image. There really is this extraordinary relationship that Michelangelo has constructed between the body of the dead Christ and his mother, the Virgin Mary, who holds him on her lap.
Mary looks very young and beautiful, but her body and her lap is sort of enlarged to carry the body of her dead son. The realism of that dead body, of its weight. One of the most beautiful passages, I think, of the sculpture is the way that she holds up his right arm and pulls up that flesh a little bit.
Yeah.
And you really feel, first of all, that the marble is transformed by Michelangelo into flesh, but also the weight of that body, and through that weight, the loss of life that's so palpable for Mary.
It's the complete lack of resistance that his body offers and the exertion that she has to extend in order to hold it. And that contrast makes for the viewer, I think, it a very physical experience looking at the sculpture.
His body looks so much like the body of a real young man, the rib cage and the abdominal muscles.
And yet it's also idealized in the way in which there's this beautiful turn of his body across her lap. And for Mary as well, there's this interesting contradiction in her sweetness and the beauty, but also the strength and the scale that's necessary for her to easily hold him. Look how deeply carved that marble is.
The drapery.
This real love of the turn of the stone, creating this very vivid sense of alternation, really, of light and shadow, of complexity, of surface, against the broad, pure surfaces of Christ's legs, of his torso, of his arm.
Mary tilts her head forward and looks down at him. His head is thrown back, so there's alternation between those two necks for me.
And his neck is exposed to us, incredibly vulnerable. Christ's foot hangs in midair. Mary, her left hand is open and pointing delicately forward, as if she's still trying to comprehend his death.
But I think there's also a way of presenting Christ's body to the viewer, saying, this is the path to salvation. This is God's sacrifice for mankind, my sacrifice of my son that makes possible your redemption.
There is a kind of rhythm that points to that hand. The drape and the knee point up towards Christ's knees, which in turn create a kind of rhythmic bridge to her hand and to that sense of wondering. This is very clearly an image that's meant to be contemplated, and the pain and the suffering that Christ has endured,
and Mary's endured,
that Mary is enduring, is meant to be contemplated as a pathway.
They're polishing the floor.
Okay, let's move on.
Beautiful work. So the next theme that we're going to be looking at is invention and fantasy. So this work of art, a triptych oil painting, meaning that there is a 3 part of the painting and then it actually opens up and closes. And this is by the early Netherlandish master Hieronymus Bosch. And as so little is known of the artist's life or intention, interpretation of this painting have ranged from warning or worldly indulgence to a dire warning of perils of life's temptations to an evocation of ultimate sexual joy. So to the left, it depicts the earthly paradise of Eden, the Garden of Eden, and hell to the right. Between the two distinct places, Bosch set the garden of earthly delights, which represent the false paradise of love. False because, though deeply pleasurable, it can lead humanity away from the bonds of marriage towards the deadly sin of lust and thus damnation. These figures this is very interesting painting. There's nothing like it in the style of it and the way the architectural things that he created. While Bosch imagined an earthly paradise, Giovanni Battista Piranesi created a subterranean dungeon using a printmaking technique known as etching. So he called this 16 prints in this series the prison, and explained that they were capricious invention from his own imagination. The image of an underground prison of ambiguous space and space and time, stairways to nowhere, and soaring dark vaults. We see this architecture from a low vantage point to emphasize its size. So Piranesi filled his frightening spaces with machines and tiny figures, and he added chains and ladders and these spiked objects that look like torture devices. So he drew these additional elements with slashing, aggressive strokes, with the result that the form adds to this scary content. So let's talk about another fantasy. The Japanese artist Yaoi Kusama created a space that we experience as a fantasy. So this installation work has its origins in the artist's mentality. So as a child, the artist herself, Kusama suffered from hallucination in which small motifs suddenly multiply into infinity, covering everything in sight, including her body. So she is very well known for this polka dots. So I think just to fully appreciate her work of art, picture does not do the justice. I think we need to take a look at some videos filmed by this guy. I don't like the music. Move forward. I don't want to see you. So she creates this amazing infinity rooms where things looks, there's a lot of mirrors to make it look like the space is infinite. Oh, this is one of my favorite. Must have been a terrifying childhood, by the way. Alright, so next topic, the next theme of art is the natural world. So during the 19th century, many American painters set themselves the American landscapes as a subject. And one of the pioneer of this movement was Thomas Cole, who was an immigrant from England. So that is his work on the left. So he is one of the leaders of the American Romanticism during the 19th century, and later on he founded the Hudson River School, which was a mid-19th century American art movement. American art movement embodied by a group of landscape painters whose aesthetic vision was influenced by Romanticism. So this painting, the Oxbow, is his most famous painting, now located in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. It depicts the great looping bend of the Connecticut River as seen from the heights of nearby mountain. To the left, a violent thunderstorm darkens the sky as it passes over the mountain wilderness. And to the right, emerging into the sunlight after the storm, broad settled by valley extends as far as the eyes can see. So this is a very beautiful painting, a depiction of the natural world. And let's take a look at another example of depiction of a natural world. Artist responding to the nature from the other side of the planet. So this painting is painted by Chinese Song Dynasty master Li Chang, and he was said to treasure ink like gold and did many landscape paintings with diluted ink, thus rendering the scenery like a dreamy mist. This is a close-up look. So he defined the soft, billowing earthen formations of the Shandong area terrain with cloud-like texture, interior layers of graded ink wash bounded by firmly brushed and scallop-edged contours. In Chinese painting, landscape is the most important and honored subject in the traditional painting. But its purpose was never to record the details of particular site or view. Rather, painters learned to paint mountains and rocks and trees and waters so that they could construct imaginary landscapes for viewers to wander through in the mind's eye. So nature has been more than a subject for an art. It has also served as a material for art. The desire to portray landscapes has been matched by the desire to create them for the pleasure of our eyes. Works such as the famous stone and gravel garden of the Buddhist temple of Ryoanji in Kyoto, Japan, seems to both sculpture and landscape gardening. So created in the late 15th century and maintained continuously since then, the garden consists solely of 5 groupings of rocks set in a rectangular expansion of raked white gravel and surrounded by an earthen wall. So these gardens are commonly known as Japanese Zen gardens or rock gardens, in which they depict the landscape scene with the natural elements such as rocks, moss, and gravel. So this work is called Spiral Jetty, an earthwork built by the American artist Robert Smithson in 1970 in the Great Salt Lake, Utah. So Smithson had become fascinated with the ecology of salt lakes, especially with the microbacteria that tinged their water a shade of red. After viewing the Great Salt Lake in Utah, he leased a small piece of land, and on its shore he began to work on this large coil of rock and earth. The Smithson was drawn to the idea that an artist could participate in the shaping of landscape almost as a geological force. So Spiral Jetty continued to change according to the natural processes after it was finished. So salt crystals accumulated and sparkled on its edges, and depth of water in and around it showed themselves in different tints of transparent, violet, pink, and red. So Spiral Jetty was submerged by the rising waters of the lake soon after it was created, but recently it resurfaced, transformed by a coating of salt crystals. And I think it is a very interesting work of art because when you think about work of art, you think of the sense of its eternal aspect of it, such as how Mona Lisa is still kept safe until now. So, but this work of art, not only the location itself, it is out in the public, I would say not even public, I would say like out in the wilderness. And the very ephemeral nature of this work, it is only remembered through the documentation of this work because now it's gone. It is very different to works that we have been seeing. So for that reason, let's take a look at this quick video of this work.
In 1970, Robert Smithson hired several people to help him create Spiral Jetty. We're standing right in the middle, at the edge of the Great Salt Lake in Utah.
But we're not seeing this the way that it existed when Smithson first created it, where it was an intersection between the land and the very odd water of the Great Salt Lake.
This is a terminal basin, a huge lake that had been largely fresh water, but there is no outlet. So the water, once it flows here from rivers and streams, collects and then simply evaporates, which means that the water is dense with minerals.
And especially with salt, very much like the Dead Sea in the Middle East. And this is one of a handful of these terminal basins that exist in the world.
Almost nothing can live here. There are a few fish that live at the outlet of some of the freshwater rivers, and
there are brine shrimp and algae. In fact, there's a particular kind of algae that makes the water turn pinkish red, and that was true when Smithson created Spiral Jetty. But today, as we look out at the lake, it's blue.
With help from the Dawn Gallery, which represented him, Smithson was able to bring a front loader and dump trucks, a tractor, to help move these basalt stones and sand and some soil into place.
By creating a spiral, Smithson created lots of opportunities where the land and the water could meet one another.
But right now, because the American West is in the midst of a drought, the water has receded and is at a great distance from this earthwork.
So instead of the water filling the spaces in between the spiral, we have sand. So this was very much meant to be a work of art that changed based on natural principles.
Smithson was interested in the idea of entropy, the idea of the way things break down, and his intervention in this natural landscape. It's an expression of the way in which artists have thought about the landscape for many years.
We could go back to artists like Caspar David Friedrich, who thought about the overwhelming size and power of nature and the smallness of man. And that's certainly one of the themes here for me as we stand here. But we could also think about the importance of the vastness of the American landscape.
Okay, so that's the Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson. And the last theme of art that we're going to look at is art about art and its institutions. Artists learn to make art by looking at art, obviously, and they look at the art of the past to learn about their predecessors, and they look at the art of the present to situate themselves amid its current and get their bearings. It should not surprise us then that artists often make art about art itself. About learning, making, and viewing it, and about its nature and social settings, about the specific movements, styles, or works. So the example that we are looking at is a masterpiece painting by Diego Velázquez Las Mineñas, painted in the year of 1656. So Velázquez used this painting to make a clear statement excuse me, about the identity of the artist as creative genius. As you can see, he inserted himself looking straight to the viewer right over here. So he came up with the idea for the image, figured out how to arrange or compose the subject matters, and studied their faces and things like that. So he used his unique style of drawing and painting to execute the work, and when he was finished, his artistic choices and decisions and style were very much admired. So to reflect on this particular work, now we see on the right. So contemporary Japanese artist Yasumasa Morimura challenges the nature of this creative role that Velázquez inserted into his painting. Morimura creates photographs that recreate these well-known works from European and American art history and transforming them by inserting himself into the image. So in his 2013 In Praise of Velázquez, copies many of Velázquez's artistic choices. So Morimura also includes his self-portrait as Velázquez did. However, every figure in Morimura's photograph is a self-portrait of himself. The artist himself dressed as each character, photographed himself, and later assembled the photographs into a single image. Some artists comment on the figures and the institution of art world, such as artists, schools, critics, museums, and etc. So activist group known as Guerrilla Girls came into being in 1985. Shortly after the opening of a huge exhibition at New York's Museum of Modern Art, the show titled International Survey of Contemporary Painting and Sculpture, which included works by 169 artists, and fewer than 10% of whom were women and less of people of color. So the Guerrilla Girls, an anonymous group of women artists, protested the absence of women from this and similar exhibitions. So they produced this iconic poster which asks, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? And noted the underrepresentation of women artists in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. So the work of the group drew attention to art institution that promoted white male artists, but ignoring women and minority artists. And the Guerrilla Girls are still going on. So let's take a look at this interview.
Women artists
It's difficult to realize that half a century ago
have never gotten the serious attention and certainly not the serious money that male artists do.
a woman was not even a person. But it took quite a long struggle by some very determined women to change this.
Hundreds of years ago in Europe, kings and queens told us what art was and was stuck with that. Now that the world aspires to democracy, why should billionaires and oligarchs define what our visual culture is?
They wear this iconic masks.
What's very good about our image is that when you look at our masks, you think of what we stand for. And we stand for the conscience of the art world. And we feel that there is underrepresentation of women and minorities.
In 1984, the Museum of Modern Art had a big exhibition. Out of close to 200 artists in the show, there were only 17 women and even fewer artists of color. And it occurred to some of us that the art world was basically a white male place, and no one asked why. You say, well, if there are no women, there are no artists of color, it just means they're not making work that's good enough. And we knew that that was a tired excuse. There was a protest, placards and chantings and a picket line. The only thing that we accomplished was to anger visitors to the museum. We noticed it didn't work. Everyone was willing to excuse the art world. So we decided that day that we had to figure out a way to make people care. There was discrimination right in front of people's noses, but they didn't see it.
The thing is, when you tell people the system is unfair, they don't really believe you. But when you show them the numbers, there's nothing they can say to counteract that.
We started to name names in the art world. Lists of galleries and museums that didn't show women and critics that didn't write about women. We would go after every cross-section in the art world. Everyone was passing the buck to someone else. The white male artist said, I can't tell my gallery what to show, and the gallerist said, I can't show women because their work doesn't sell, and then collectors would say, well, I can't buy women or artists of color because I don't see them. We were just angry. If art is a record of culture, and the art doesn't look like the culture, and the art is told only through the works of white males, that's basically what it is. It's the history of patriarchy, not the history of who we are.
That's Guerrilla Girls challenging the institution of art. So this is it for the chapter 3, and next week we're getting to the chapter 4, which is going to be a lot of technical terms of analyzing visual composition of artworks. So there will be a lot of information that you're going to have to absorb. So yeah, I'll see you guys next week on the lecture video, and everyone stay safe.